The war in Vietnam had entered its most volatile year. By March 1968, the Tet Offensive had left much of the country scarred and unstable. Around 10, the radio in the maintenance bay crackled to life. A medevac Huey from the 114th Assault Helicopter Company had gone down. The transmission was faint, broken by static, but the words were unmistakable. Mayday, tail rotor gone, taking fire. Then silence. And somewhere in an archive box, under layers of dust, the maintenance log still sits. 4 names, 1 date, a single sentence, all that remains of the day 4 men decided that can't wasn't an option. It is not a story of glory, but of grit. And for those who understand the true nature of war, that's what heroism really looks like. The crew gathered around the radio. Through the haze of static, a second call came through from an infantry unit nearby. The downed Huey had crashed in a flooded rice paddy near Can Tho. The pilots were alive, but trapped under machine gun fire from the tree line. Rescue teams were being coordinated, but the nearest available helicopter support was more than an hour away. For men pinned down in an open field, that was a lifetime. Jackson looked at his men, then at the half-repaired Huey sitting on their pad. He didn't wait for orders. "We're going," he said simply. Collins blinked. "Sir, we're maintenance." "We don't have clearance." Jackson's tone didn't change. "If we don't go, they're dead before clearance gets here." He turned to Brooks. "Fuel pump, hoses, patch kit. Load them." To Taylor, "Grab tools, everything that'll fit in 2 boxes." The men hesitated only for a second, then moved. By 10:30, they had loaded into a support helicopter bound for the coordinates. The pilot, a young warrant officer with orders to resupply another post, protested. Jackson handed him a spare belt of ammunition and said, "We'll make it quick." The pilot sighed and lifted off. The flight south took less than 20 minutes, though it felt much longer. Every division was stretched thin. Every air mission ran at maximum capacity, and helicopter units bore the brunt of the burden. The UH-1 Huey, once a symbol of American mobility and dominance, was now the most overworked machine in Southeast Asia. The Mekong stretched out below, its channels glittering like metal under the sun. Columns of smoke rose in the distance. As they neared the coordinates, they saw it, a dark shape in the flooded rice paddies, half submerged and smoking. The Huey had come down hard, tail broken, one skid buried in mud. The pilots were crouched behind the wreckage, rifles firing in short bursts toward the dense tree line that bordered the field. Viet Cong positions were invisible, but the muzzle flashes were unmistakable. Bullets cut through the water, sending sprays into the air. The pilot of Jackson's chopper shouted over the roar of the engine, "I can't land in that!" "Too hot!" Jackson pointed to a dry berm about 50 yards away. "Put us there." "We'll walk." The helicopter flared low, kicking up waves of water and mud. Before it even touched down, Jackson's crew jumped out, each man sinking to his thighs in the flooded paddy. The support helicopter lifted off immediately, drawing enemy fire as it banked away. The 4 mechanics slogged toward the wreck, the water heavy and stinking of rot. Bullets hissed around them, splashing within arm's reach. Taylor carried the toolboxes on his shoulders. Collins had the spare parts bag strapped to his back. Brooks stumbled once, nearly losing his footing, but Jackson pulled him up without a word. When they reached the downed Huey, the pilot's eyes widened. They had expected soldiers, not mechanics. "You're the rescue?" one shouted over the noise. "We're the fix," Jackson replied, sliding into the mud beside the tail section. For the men of the 1st Aviation Brigade, the war was less about grand strategy and more about survival, keeping machines in the air when everything on the ground was falling apart. At Vinh Long Army Airfield, the 605th Transportation Detachment functioned like a surgical team for broken aircraft. The Huey's tail rotor had been sheared off by a direct hit. The drive shaft was twisted, the gearbox cracked, and the hydraulic line severed. Jackson ran his hands over the damage, shaking his head. "She's hurt bad."
"But not dead." He turned to Collins. "Get the blades off."
"We'll have to rig it light." The next few minutes were chaos. The enemy fire intensified, forcing the men to crouch behind the fuselage. Jackson worked methodically, unbolting panels, handing parts up to Brooks. He patched a ruptured hydraulic line with a section of spare hose, sealing it with wire and electrical tape. Collins and Taylor removed the damaged tail section coupling and replaced it with a salvaged piece from their kit. Sweat mixed with the rainwater running down their faces. Each movement carried risk. Every time a man stood, a bullet cracked overhead. One round tore through Collins's sleeve, grazing his arm. He didn't flinch. "Still good," he muttered, tightening a bolt. The sound of distant mortars echoed, followed by the crack of M16 fire as one of the pilots laid down suppressive bursts from behind the skids. By noon, the sun had turned the air thick and shimmering. The water around them reeked of fuel and mud. Jackson crawled beneath the fuselage, hammering at the transmission housing with a wrench. "Come on, baby," he grunted, striking it again and again until the coupling seated. He pulled himself out, signaling to Brooks. "Prime the pump." Brooks flipped the manual fuel lever and hit the starter. The engine coughed once, sputtered, then caught with a roar. The rotor blades creaked as they began to turn, scattering mud and water in wide arcs. For the first time in hours, the field was filled not with gunfire, but the whine of turbine power. The Viet Cong gunfire faltered. The sound of the spinning rotor seemed to confuse them. The Americans took advantage of the pause. One pilot shouted, "We can lift!" Jackson looked at the others, his face streaked with grime. "Then let's lift," he said. As the Huey strained against the mud, the mechanics shoved from below, water up to their chests. Slowly, impossibly, the helicopter rose. The air rippled with heat and smoke as it climbed, unsteady but airborne. Jackson grabbed onto the skid and hauled himself up, yelling over the roar of the engine, "Don't stop till we're clear!" Behind them, the rice fields shimmered under the midday sun. The wreck they'd found broken was flying again, a wounded bird made whole by hands that refused to give up. For the men aboard, it wasn't just a rescue. It was proof that skill and courage could lift even steel from the mud. And for the 605th, it would become the story they'd tell for the rest of their lives, the day the mechanics went to war. The heat that afternoon hung over the flooded field like a living thing. The air shimmered, heavy with gunpowder and humidity, and every breath carried the taste of oil and wet rice stalks. The moment Jackson and his men hit the ground, the world narrowed to survival and work. There was no cover, no time to think, only the job in front of them. Make the helicopter fly again before the enemy reached it. Bullets snapped overhead, striking the water with sharp, violent splashes. Each impact sent mud across their faces. Jackson kept low, his voice steady despite the chaos. "Stay with me. Watch the tree line." He pointed to the broken tail section jutting awkwardly into the air. The entire rotor assembly had been ripped away, leaving jagged metal and twisted cables. "We'll have to pull the blades," he barked. It was madness, field repairs under active fire, but they'd done impossible things before, just never this close to death. Collins and Brooks climbed onto the Sluck fuselage, balancing as bullets smacked the water around them. Collins' hands worked quickly, loosening bolts with a wrench while Brooks pried at bent panels with a crowbar. Below them, Jackson crawled through the waist-deep mud toward the tail boom, inspecting the damage by touch. The metal was hot and slick from leaking hydraulic fluid. A section of the drive shaft had twisted clean in half. He shouted to Taylor, "I need the coupling kit, the small one with the pin sleeve." Taylor dropped to his knees in the water, rummaging through the toolbox, his fingers trembling but sure. The pilots, huddled behind the helicopter's shattered frame, joined in. One of them, Lieutenant Morgan, had blood streaming from a cut above his eye, but he refused to stop helping. He passed tools up to the mechanics, yelling enemy positions between breaths. The second pilot, Chief Warrant Officer Delaney, fired short bursts from his M16 toward the tree line whenever muzzle flashes appeared. Their defensive fire bought seconds, just seconds, but it was enough. The ground shook as a mortar round landed somewhere behind them, sending a plume of muddy water skyward. Fragments whistled past. The men ducked instinctively, then went right back to work. War had stripped away fear and left only instinct: fix, fight, survive. Jackson wiped the sweat from his eyes and leaned over the open panel near the transmission. The hydraulic line was torn. He reached for the spare hose, cutting a length with his knife, his hands coated in grease and blood. "If we can get her hydraulics back, we've got a chance," he muttered. He slid the makeshift line into place, tightening it with a wrench. The movement was automatic, years of maintenance condensed into seconds of action. Their camp sat on the edge of the Mekong Delta, surrounded by muddy canals and palm groves. The men worked from sunrise to sundown, repairing choppers that came in riddled with bullet holes, tail booms bent, fuel lines leaking. A shout went up. Collins had been hit. The round tore through his shoulder, spinning him sideways off the fuselage. He crashed into the mud with a grunt. Jackson lunged toward him, dragging him behind the helicopter. "Hold still," he ordered. He tore a strip from his undershirt and wrapped it around the wound, knotting it tight. Collins gritted his teeth but didn't complain. "I can still work," he gasped. Jackson stared at him for a second, then nodded. "Fine, keep low and check the rotor bolts." They had no medics, no coursemen, and no support. The maintenance helicopter that had dropped them off was circling somewhere above, low on fuel and taking occasional pot shots from the jungle. Over the radio, the pilot's voice crackled. "Can't stay long. You've got maybe 20 minutes before I'm out." Jackson didn't even respond. There was no time for that kind of math. The field had turned into a cauldron of heat and noise. The smell of diesel mixed with the stink of stagnant water and burning vegetation. Every few minutes, a round found its way into the fuselage, clanging against the armor plating or punching holes in the tail section. Each sound made Taylor flinch, but he never stopped feeding tools to Jackson. Brooks, his hands black with oil, reconnected the wiring for the ignition system. "Ready on fuel," he shouted. Jackson crawled under the tail again, hammering the bent metal around the driveshaft coupling. His body ached from crouching in the water, but he didn't let up. Come on," he whispered as he aligned the parts. The men around him were silent, except for the rhythmic clank of tools and the occasional curse. Even the enemy fire seemed to fade into the background. It was just another noise in the constant storm. Then, at last, something shifted. The transmission belt caught with a snap. Jackson's heart jumped. "All right, Brooks, give it a crank." Brooks twisted the starter. The Huey coughed once, the engine sputtering like a dying animal. It belched black smoke, then fell silent. "Again!" Jackson yelled. Brooks tried once more. This time the engine gave a deeper growl before stalling again. "She wants to live," Jackson muttered, slapping the side of the fuselage like a stubborn mule. He climbed up beside Brooks and peered into the intake. A cracked fuel line was bleeding pressure. He patched it with a scrap of rubber tubing, sealing it with his last strip of electrical tape. The next attempt was different. When Brooks hit the starter, the Huey roared to life with a shriek that seemed to tear through the battlefield. The rotor blades creaked, then began to spin, scattering water and debris. The noise drowned everything, even the gunfire. Jackson froze for a moment, listening to that beautiful, violent sound. "She's breathing," he said, almost in disbelief. The Viet Cong must have heard it too. The rate of enemy fire slowed, uncertain. To them, it must have sounded impossible, an aircraft they'd shot down now rising again. Jackson turned to his men. "Get in, now!" Taylor and Collins scrambled aboard. The pilots followed, strapping in, their hands slick with mud. Brooks and Jackson pushed at the skids, freeing them from the suction of the mud. The helicopter wobbled, blades whining under the strain. Brooks climbed in, and Jackson followed last, his boots slipping as he hauled himself onto the skid. "Pull pitch!" he shouted to the pilot. The Huey lifted, sluggish at first, then steadier as it gained momentum. Mud and water exploded outward in all directions. The ground beneath them seemed to shrink as the aircraft clawed its way upward. Tracers lanced through the air, some close enough that Jackson could feel the heat pass by his face. He ducked behind the doorframe, gripping the handle with both hands. At 20 feet, the rotor caught full power, and the Huey surged forward. The tree line flashed beneath them, the rice paddies stretching into green and gold. The helicopter shuddered violently, the patched hydraulics struggling to hold, but it kept flying. Taylor whooped over the noise, the sound wild and defiant. Below them, the enemy fire faded, replaced by the mechanical roar of the engine. Against all odds, the mechanics had done it. They weren't pilots, they weren't supposed to fly, but they had rebuilt a machine in the middle of a firefight and lifted it back into the sky. As they cleared the last of the smoke, Jackson looked down at the field disappearing behind them. For the first time that day, he allowed himself a breath. "Told you she wasn't dead," he said quietly, more to the helicopter than to anyone else. The others just stared at him, exhausted and grinning, as the Mekong stretched out ahead. Proof that sometimes, even in war, fixing something broken could save them all. The helicopter lurched as it left the ground, its skids sucking free from the mud with a wet pop that sent ripples through the flooded paddy below. The patched Huey groaned in protest, as though the air itself resisted the weight of its improbable resurrection. Jackson clung to the skid, his boots slipping on the wet metal, the rotors above chopping at the humid air with a mechanical scream. Brooks reached out from the open doorway, his fingers slick with oil and sweat, shouting over the engine's roar. "Grab my arm, Sergeant! You're gonna fall!" Jackson swung up, catching Brooks' wrist with both hands. The pilot kept the helicopter level as best he could, fighting the torque with the pedals. The cabin rattled violently, bolts and panels shivering from the strain. Inside, the gauges flickered erratically, oil pressure low, temperature high, the altimeter climbing one hesitant foot at a time. The Huey's wounded frame protested every motion. "Keep her steady!" yelled Lieutenant Morgan, his voice nearly lost to the thunder of the rotors. His knuckles were white around the cyclic, his face streaked with grime and blood. "If that rotor coupling gives out, we're done." Jackson finally hauled himself inside, landing hard against the floor. His hands were raw and bleeding, but he grinned through the exhaustion. "She'll hold," he said, half to himself, half to the trembling machine. Below them, the rice paddies blurred into streaks of brown and green. Then came the first burst of enemy fire. Tracers stitched the air from the tree line, red lines slashing past the tail boom. The crew ducked instinctively as rounds pinged against the fuselage. One round shattered the lower windshield, spraying glass into the cockpit. The pilots flinched but kept control. Collins, still bleeding from his shoulder, manned the door gun. His pale face was set in grim focus as he racked the M60 and fired. The belt-fed weapon rattled to life, spitting fire into the trees. Short bursts, disciplined, just enough to keep the enemy's heads down. The empty shells clattered to the floor, rolling beneath his boots. "That'll teach 'em to shoot at my bird," he shouted, forcing a grin through the pain. The Huey climbed in small, desperate increments. 50 feet, 100, then back down to 80 as the rotor struggled against drag. The hydraulic patch hissed, straining to maintain pressure. Jackson crouched beside the engine housing, one hand steadying a shaking panel. He could smell the heat, a metallic, burning scent that meant they were running the engine near its limit. "Just get us south," he shouted. "She can die after that." The Viet Cong fire didn't stop. Below, muzzle flashes winked in the fading light, and the sound of gunfire rolled like thunder over the delta. One bullet punched through the tail boom, ricocheting off the inner frame. Another tore through the pilot's seat back, narrowly missing Morgan's shoulder. "We can't take another hit like that," Delaney yelled, pushing the collective forward. The Huey dipped and swayed, flying barely 50 feet above the flooded fields. The flight became a test of endurance, of man and machine alike. The rotor blades screamed at full RPM, vibrating with a high-pitched whine that rattled teeth. Jackson checked the patchwork repairs through the open side door, eyes tracking the wobbling tail rotor. Every second he expected it to snap, sending them spinning into oblivion. Yet somehow it didn't. The improvised coupling held. The hydraulics continued to pump, and the patch transmission turned with steady rhythm. Most of the crew were African-American mechanics, young men who'd learned to improvise fixes with scrap parts, duct tape, and courage. Their workshops were built from old Connex boxes and corrugated tin. The air smelled of oil, sweat, and the constant drone of engines testing on the flight line. For 10 long minutes they flew low and fast, hugging the contours of the land. Smoke drifted behind them from the leaking exhaust, forming a dark trail in the sky. The sun, low and red, cast the Mekong Delta in an eerie glow. None of the men spoke. They didn't need to. Each was locked into the same silent calculation, how far they could get before the Huey gave up. Inside the cabin, the air was thick with fumes. Brooks leaned forward, wiping sweat from his brow, his eyes darting between the fuel gauge and the trembling RPM needle. "We're running hot," he muttered. "I know," said Morgan flatly. "If we back off, we drop." It was the kind of impossible choice every pilot dreaded. Push the engine and risk fire, or ease up and risk a crash. They chose to push. Then, suddenly, the gunfire ceased. The last of the tracers faded into the horizon, and the jungle below turned quiet. It wasn't peace, just distance. For the first time since takeoff, they were beyond range. The men exchanged quick glances, too wary to celebrate yet. "Almost there," Delaney said, pointing ahead. Through the haze, the outline of a small outpost came into view, a dirt clearing with 2 sandbagged revetments and a single windsock limp in the humid air. "Hang on," the pilot warned. The approach was rough, no time for finesse. The landing zone was narrow, half covered in puddles and debris. The Huey came in hard, skimming over the wire and slamming into the mud. The skids hit uneven ground, sending the helicopter sliding sideways. The right skid collapsed under the impact, and the fuselage tilted sharply before settling upright. The engine sputtered once, twice, then died with a final mechanical sigh. For a moment, no one moved. The only sound was the ticking of cooling metal and the distant hum of insects. Then Jackson let out a long breath and leaned back against the bulkhead, his entire body trembling. "We made it," he said quietly. The words didn't sound triumphant, just stunned. The pilots unstrapped and turned to face the crew. Morgan reached out his hand, shaking Jackson's firmly. "You boys just pulled off a miracle," he said, his voice rough. Brooks laughed wearily. "Nah," he replied, "we just fixed what was broken." Collins slumped against the doorframe, his wounded shoulder wrapped in a strip of oily bandage, and managed a smile. "Next time," he said, "we're charging extra." The outpost medics ran out, drawn by the noise. They helped Collins down first, then checked the pilots. The Huey sat tilted in the mud, its patched tail streaked with soot and holes. It looked more like a relic than a machine that had just flown through hell. But it had done its job, and so had the men who refused to leave it behind. As the sun dipped below the tree line, the field fell into shadow. The smell of hot metal and oil still clung to the air. Jackson stood for a long moment beside the helicopter, one hand resting on its scarred skin. "You did good," he murmured, patting the hull like an old friend. The others watched him, silent, understanding. For them, this wasn't heroism. It was the craft, the belief that a machine built by human hands could always be brought back to life if someone cared enough to try. They were mechanics, not soldiers of fame. But that day, in the mud and fire of a foreign rice field, they had proven something rare, that skill and courage could defy even the laws of war. As darkness settled over the delta, the men of the 605th sat together beside the battered helicopter, too tired to speak, too alive to sleep. Somewhere beyond the horizon, artillery thundered. But here, for a brief, impossible moment, the war was silent, and the machine they saved stood as quiet proof that determination could lift even steel from the mud. When the message reached battalion headquarters that a group of mechanics had flown a crippled Huey out of enemy territory, the first reaction wasn't celebration, it was disbelief. The report sounded like something out of a barracks story, a rumor passed between mess tents. Maintenance crews didn't lead rescues. They patched aircraft, filed reports, and sent them back to pilots. The idea that a handful of black mechanics from the 605th Transportation Detachment had taken off into a hot zone, repaired a helicopter under fire, and then flown it out themselves seemed impossible. At first, the operations officer thought it was a misunderstanding. Maybe a rescue team had arrived after all, and someone got the details wrong. But the pilot's own transmission cleared that up. Bird recovered, crew safe, assisted by ground maintenance personnel, extraction successful. There was a long pause over the line. Someone muttered, "Maintenance personnel?" as if the words didn't belong in a combat report. By the next morning, word spread through the 1st Aviation Brigade like wildfire. In the chow hall, pilots retold the story with growing amazement. A Huey brought back to life in the middle of a firefight, flown out by the men who were supposed to stay behind the wire. Some swore it wasn't true, that the machine couldn't have possibly lifted after taking that kind of damage. Others said they'd seen the patched bird with their own eyes. At Vin Long Airfield, the commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel James Burrows, called for an immediate debrief. Jackson and his men were flown back in the same day. They arrived still wearing the mud-stained uniforms from the mission, their hands rough with dried oil and grime. The men didn't look like heroes. They looked like mechanics who'd just finished a long shift. The debrief room was hot and cramped, a single fan pushing air that smelled faintly of kerosene. Burrows sat at the head of the table with a stack of reports in front of him. He didn't look up as the men entered. "Sergeant Jackson," he said finally, "sit down and tell me what exactly happened out there." Jackson, never much for words, stood instead. His voice was steady, unhurried, as he described the sequence. Hearing the distress call, loading up their maintenance chopper, the decision to go without waiting for orders. He talked through the repairs, the tail rotor coupling, the patched hydraulics, the makeshift hose sealed with tape. Every detail was technical, precise, without embellishment. When he finished, Burrows removed his glasses and stared at him for a long moment. "Let me get this straight," he said slowly. "You took 4 men into an active kill zone, fixed a helicopter with field tools, and then flew it out yourselves, all without authorization?" "Yes, sir," Jackson replied. There was silence, then the colonel let out a short laugh, the kind that carried both disbelief and admiration. "Well, Sergeant," he said, leaning back, "that's either pure insanity or the best damn maintenance operation I've ever heard of." The other officers in the room smiled faintly, shaking their heads. One of them muttered, "You couldn't script that if you tried."
In the days that followed, the story took on a life of its own. The downed pilots came by the hangar to thank them personally, still limping from their injuries. They brought beer, cigarettes, and a few cans of instant coffee, small tokens but heartfelt. The crew from the 605 didn't talk much about it. They just went back to work. But around the airfield, the legend grew. Pilots would stop by the maintenance bays to shake hands with the boys who flew their own fix.
Staff Sergeant Robert R.J. Jackson was their leader. 32 years old, from Shreveport, Louisiana, Jackson was known for his calm under pressure and his ability to coax life out of machines that others had written off as scrap. The Huey itself became a kind of trophy. It was parked at the far end of the ramp, still scorched and bent in places, its tail patched with mismatched aluminum. The men from the night shift painted a message across the side in thick black grease pencil. She flew again. Every crew that passed by stopped to read it. Some left notes scrawled in chalk. Respect. Good work, brothers. Meanwhile, the Army bureaucracy lumbered forward, as it always did. The incident report traveled up the chain of command, collecting stamps and signatures. The official summary read, "Field recovery of downed aircraft under hostile conditions. Crew and airframe successfully extracted. No casualties." It was filed under logistics, not valor. No medals, no commendations. Just another line in a thick binder of daily operations. Still, in the barracks and motor pools, everyone knew the truth. "That's the crew from Vin Long," soldiers would say. "The ones who fixed a bird in a firefight." It became shorthand for ingenuity under pressure, the kind of story that engineers and mechanics told each other when the job felt impossible. For Jackson and his men, the attention felt strange. They hadn't gone out looking for glory. They were just doing what they'd been trained to do, repair what was broken. "We weren't heroes," Collins said later. "We were just stubborn. We weren't leaving that bird behind." One evening, a group of pilots invited the crew to the officers' club, a rare gesture in a military still divided by rank and often by race. The room went quiet when they entered. Then someone started clapping. Jackson, uncomfortable with the attention, nodded once and took a seat near the back. When one pilot raised a glass and said, "To the best mechanics in the Delta," the rest joined in. For a brief moment, the war outside seemed far away. But not everyone celebrated. A few officers in headquarters questioned the breach of protocol. "They could have been killed," one memo read. "Maintenance personnel are not to engage in unsanctioned recovery operations." The reprimand never reached Jackson directly, but word filtered down. When asked later if he would have done anything differently, he shrugged. "If I had to fill out a form first, we'd be burying those pilots." In the maintenance bay, life returned to routine. The men still worked 12-hour days, still patched bullet holes and replaced transmissions, still wiped their hands on oil-soaked rags before lighting cigarettes. But there was a quiet pride now, not loud or boastful, just a shared understanding that they had done something no manual could teach. Weeks later, when another Huey came in full of holes, the pilot climbed out and said, "You the crew that fixed that bird in the field?" Jackson nodded. The pilot grinned. "Then I want you on mine." The story of that day never reached newspapers or official histories, but within the 1st Aviation Brigade, it spread faster than any formal citation could. The man of the 605th had proven that courage wasn't limited to those in the cockpit. It could come from grease-stained hands and the simple belief that no machine or man was beyond saving. By the time the rainy season returned, the phrase had become part of airfield slang. When a helicopter limped back to base with barely enough lift to land, someone would shout across the tarmac, "She'll fly again!" And everyone knew exactly what it meant. It wasn't about the machine anymore. It was about the men who refused to quit.
His men called him Chief Fixer, though his rank was lower than that. He'd been in country long enough to stop flinching at explosions. And for Jackson, that was enough. He didn't need a medal or a commendation. The fact that the bird had flown, that his team had brought 2 pilots home, was the only record that mattered. As he told a young recruit one night, tightening a bolt under the wing of another battered Huey, "You don't need wings to fly in this war. You just need to believe you can get something moving when everyone else says it's dead." By the time the monsoon rains ended in 1968, the war had shifted again. The front lines were never fixed in Vietnam. They slid like shadows across the map. What had been a hot zone one month was quiet the next, and another province burned in its place. For Jackson's maintenance crew, the change barely registered. The missions never stopped. Helicopters still came back riddled with holes, engines seized, or rotors splintered from too many hard landings. Every night, the lights in the Vinh Long hangar burned late, and the men of the 605th kept the Army's flying machines alive. The helicopter they'd saved, the one pulled from the rice field, had been catalogued back into service as Tail 739. Its patched fuselage and mismatched tail boom made it instantly recognizable across the base. Pilots treated it with a mix of awe and superstition. Some refused to fly it, saying it had already used up its luck. Others requested it, calling it the bird that refused to die. Jackson didn't care about the talk. To him, it was just another machine, one that had done its job and would do it again. In the weeks that followed, the repaired Huey flew everything from medevac runs to troop transports. The logs showed over 100 flight hours added after the rescue. Its patched hydraulics held firm. The rotor coupling they'd replaced in the mud lasted longer than expected. It was almost poetic. The helicopter that had been left for scrap became one of the most reliable aircraft in its detachment. The pilots who flew it said it handled like it had something to prove. Jackson's team never stopped working. Each day started before dawn with a line of helicopters waiting for inspection. Some came in dripping hydraulic fluid like open wounds. Others had panels scorched black from near misses. The mechanics moved through them with precision. Torque wrenches, patch kits, rivet guns, and long hours under the oppressive delta heat. They ate when they could, smoked when they couldn't, and slept on the hangar floor if the night shift ran too long. Brooks, ever the joker, liked to say, "We're the only people in this war who fight gravity more than the enemy." It was half a joke, half truth. Mechanics like them rarely saw the front lines, but their fingerprints were on every mission. Without their labor, the pilots couldn't fly, the medevacs couldn't lift, and the infantry couldn't move. "Nobody remembers the guys with grease on their hands," Brooks added one night, wiping oil from his face. "But we're the reason those birds come back at all." The war had become routine in its chaos. Each day bled into the next. Sirens, rotor wash, and the constant hum of engines. Occasionally, a familiar call sign wouldn't return, and the hangar would fall silent for a few minutes before someone broke it with, "Let's get back to it." The work was relentless, but it was also grounding. For men like Jackson, fixing things was how they made sense of the senseless. Every so often, orders would send them north, where the fighting was heavier. They'd load their tools into cargo birds, fly into temporary outposts, and set up makeshift repair zones under camouflage netting. The conditions were brutal. Mud up to their knees, mosquitoes thick enough to blacken a sleeve, and the constant thump of distant artillery. Yet the routine never changed. Fix what's broken, send it back up, repeat. Jackson's crew had become a kind of legend within the brigade. Not the headline kind. Their story never made Stars and Stripes or Armed Forces Radio, but the kind told in mess tents and over static-filled radio channels. "If your bird goes down, call the Vinh Long boys," soldiers would say. "They'll find a way to make it fly again." It wasn't pride that drove them, it was obligation. Machines were lives in this war,
and letting one stay grounded meant someone else might not make it home.
Months later, during a supply run near Cantho, their transport passed low over the same rice paddies where they'd made the impossible repair. The fields looked the same: brown water, green edges, the distant shimmer of the tree line. Collins, sitting by the window, tapped Jackson on the shoulder and pointed down. "There," he said, "that's the spot." Jackson leaned forward, squinting. In the distance, the outline of twisted metal caught the light. A piece of the old tail rotor, half buried in the mud, still glinted under the Vietnamese sun. He never boasted, never raised his voice, he just worked. Under him served Specialist Terry Collins, a wiry 20-year-old with a gift for hydraulics. Private First Class Eddie Brooks, a quiet engine tech who'd grown up working on cars in Detroit. And Specialist Jerome Taylor, the youngest, barely 19, who handled tools and could strip a gearbox blindfolded. For a long moment, no one spoke. The sight brought back the chaos, the shouting, the gunfire, the smell of burning oil. Then Brooks broke the silence. "Guess we left our signature," he said with a grin. Jackson just nodded. "Let it rust," he replied quietly. "It's done its job." The helicopter banked south, leaving the field behind, and the memory folded back into silence. Back at base, life continued. The war machine ground forward, and men rotated in and out of country like clockwork. Jackson's tour extended twice. Replacements came and went, learning the trade from him before moving on. He became something of a mentor, not through speeches, but through example. When a young mechanic complained about the endless repairs, Jackson simply said, "You don't quit on a bird, ever. That's someone's ride home." The longer they stayed, the more the lines blurred between routine and survival. They learned to tune out the distant gunfire and the occasional rocket attack on the airfield. When alarms went off, they ducked under workbenches, waited for the blasts to pass, and then went right back to tightening bolts. Their humor was dark, their patience infinite. "We fix death traps," Taylor said once, tightening a fuel line, "and somehow that makes us feel alive." As the months passed, the repaired Huey finally reached the end of its service. The logbooks showed 112 flight hours after its resurrection before an inspection team grounded it for good. Its patched frame was tired, its engine overdue for replacement, but the aircraft had done more than anyone had expected. It was dismantled for parts, tail section to one unit, rotor blades to another. Jackson stood watching as they hauled the stripped fuselage to the edge of the field. He didn't say much, just ran his hand along the faded paint. "She gave us everything," he said softly. That night, as the sun set over the Mekong Delta, the sound of helicopters filled the sky once more. A mix of new birds and old, each carrying the scars of war. The mechanics watched them lift into the amber haze, the noise washing over the hangar like a storm. Jackson turned to his men and said what they all knew. "There'll be another down before morning. Let's be ready." The war moved on, relentless and indifferent. But somewhere out there, rusting quietly in a forgotten rice field, a piece of tail 739 still marked the place where a handful of mechanics refused to give up. A fragment of metal that for a moment had defied the impossible and carried them all out of hell. And in the long rhythm of the war, that was enough. When the war finally ended, the noise stopped. But for the men who had lived inside it, silence felt strange. The whine of engines, the hammer of rotor blades, the metallic tang of oil and smoke, all of it had been the rhythm of their lives. For Staff Sergeant Robert R.J. Jackson, that sound had been his world for years. When he stepped off the plane in Louisiana in 1971, the stillness of the small regional airport felt heavier than the war itself. No one waited with a brass band or cameras. He just carried his duffel bag, caught a bus south, and went home.
Jackson found work quickly at a civilian aircraft maintenance company in Baton Rouge. The machines were different, cleaner, quieter, made for business travelers instead of soldiers, but the work was the same. He spent his days tightening bolts, checking pressure gauges, replacing cracked seals. Colleagues said he was precise, almost obsessive about safety. Few of them knew that 3 years earlier he had rebuilt a helicopter in a rice field while under fire. He never brought it up. When asked about Vietnam, he would only shrug and say, "I fixed things."
Specialist Terry Collins went a different way. His shoulder wound healed, though it left him with a faint limp. After his discharge, he used the GI Bill to study mechanical engineering, then took a job teaching shop class at a high school in Detroit. His students knew he had been in Vietnam. The prosthetic scar along his upper arm hinted at it. But he never told war stories. What he did talk about was teamwork, precision, and how there's no such thing as a lost cause if you know how to work a wrench. He taught those kids how to build engines, but what he really passed down was persistence. Eddie Brooks and Jerome Taylor both stayed in uniform. Brooks re-enlisted and served through the 1970s, rising to staff sergeant before retiring from Fort Hood. Taylor stayed in aviation maintenance until 1980, earning a reputation as the man who could fix anything with a roll of tape and a pocket knife. Neither of them ever spoke publicly about that day in 1968. "We just did what we were trained to do," Brooks once told an interviewer. "The pilots were alive, so we kept them that way." That morning, the airfield had been unusually still. Rain had softened the dirt into thick mud, and most flights were grounded until the weather cleared. For decades, the story vanished into the blur of 1,000 other unrecorded acts. Historians wrote about helicopter pilots and infantrymen, about the great battles of Hue, Khe Sanh, and the Tet Offensive. But no one wrote about the men who kept the machines in the air, the mechanics who lived in the background, turning wrenches while the world looked elsewhere. The Army's paperwork on the incident amounted to 4 lines in a maintenance report. Field repair and extraction, hostile area, 14 March 1968. Personnel, 605th Transdet. Outcome, aircraft recovered. It might have stayed that way forever if not for a young aviation historian named Douglas Kinney. In the early 1990s, he was collecting oral histories for a project on the evolution of helicopter maintenance during Vietnam. While scanning through microfilm in the Army Aviation Museum archives, he stumbled across the obscure maintenance log with the strange entry, "Field repair and extraction." He'd never seen those words together before. Intrigued, he traced the unit, the 605th Transportation Detachment, and began searching for veterans. Kinney's letters went unanswered for months until one reached Jackson's address in Louisiana. When the historian called, Jackson's voice on the other end was cautious, polite, and quiet. "I remember that day," he said simply. "It wasn't anything special. We just weren't going to leave those men there." Kinney asked to record an interview. Jackson agreed, but only if he could bring in the others. 2 months later, they met in a community center outside Houston. Jackson, Brooks, and Collins, with Taylor joining later by phone from Georgia. The interview lasted 6 hours. The men spoke slowly, sometimes pausing for long stretches before answering. Jackson described the sound of bullets hitting water. Collins talked about wrapping his own wound and climbing back on the bird. Brooks laughed when he recalled the engine refusing to start. "We hit it like a damn mule," he said. And Taylor's voice over the phone added, "And that mule finally ran." Kinney's recording became part of a larger oral history collection. When he published the account in a small aviation journal in 1996, it drew modest attention from veterans groups. The title was simple: "They weren't pilots, but they flew." The story described 4 black mechanics who defied orders, rebuilt a helicopter under enemy fire, and flew it out themselves. There were no dramatic quotes or embellishments, just the bare facts told in their own words. By the time the article appeared, most of the men had already begun to fade into history. Collins passed away in 1994, Brooks in 1997. Taylor retired to rural Georgia, where he lived quietly until his death a few years later. Jackson lived the longest, dying in 2003 at the age of 67. In his obituary, there was no mention of Vietnam. It listed him only as aircraft technician and family man. But the Army Aviation Museum took notice. In 2005, one of Kinney's students, now a curator, located a faded photograph in the archives labeled simply Vin Long 1968. In it, 4 men stood in front of a patched-up UH-1 Huey, their fatigue-soaked, faces streaked with oil and sweat. One of them, Jackson, leaned against the tail boom, smiling faintly. The caption, later added by hand, read, "They weren't pilots, but they flew."
The photo now hangs in a quiet corner of the museum in Fort Rucker, Alabama. Visitors pass it every day, soldiers, historians, school children, most without stopping. But those who notice it sometimes ask about the story behind it, and the docents tell them, "That bird was dead in the mud, but these men made it fly again." It isn't framed in gold or marked as an official exhibit. It's just a photograph, simple, grainy, almost humble, much like the men it depicts. Their legacy doesn't rest in medals or citations. It endures in the language of every crew chief and mechanic who's ever said, "We'll get her flying." It lives in the unspoken understanding that maintenance work, though unseen, saves lives. The men of the 605th proved that courage didn't always wear wings. Sometimes it wore oil-stained fatigues and carried a wrench instead of a rifle. In the end, history forgot their names, but not their example. In a war built on machines and confusion, they showed that skill, brotherhood, and determination could lift even a shattered helicopter from the mud and carry life out of fire. Long after the sound of rotors faded and the rice fields of Vietnam grew quiet again, their story remained. Not loud, not celebrated, but alive in the quiet pride of every mechanic who knows that sometimes the difference between death and survival comes down to the hands willing to try when everything else has failed.